Good evening, everyone. Okay. Good evening, everyone. First of all, very welcome to INSPER and to some of you to São Paulo, to Brazil. We are very honored to be hosting this closing session, the keynote session, and the closing of this wonderful conference that we have in the previous 3 days. I'm Luciana Young. I'm a professor of law and economics here at the INSPER, and I'm very honored to be chairing this closing session tonight. We have, as you already know, Professor Adam Chilton, Dean and Howard J. Kirain, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, and he will be presenting us with his great paper, Why Constitutions Fail. So just a short bio here. Professor Adam Chilton is co-editor of the Journal of Law and Economics and a fellow of the Society for Empirical Legal Studies. He works at the intersection of international law, comparative law, and empirical legal studies with attention to constitutional design, human rights, judicial behavior, and legal education. He's the author of How Constitutions' Rights Matter with Mila Versteeg, 2020, and Trial by Numbers with Carlo Rosima, 2024, the later devoted to statistical evidence in legal practice. Professor Chilton, it's a great honor to have you here. Please.
It's great to be here. And since this is the closing session of this conference, I wanted to start by thanking all of the conference organizers that made this fantastic event over the last few days possible. It's brought together people not just from Sao Paulo or from Brazil, but from the United States and other countries that have a general interest in legal studies. So hope you all join me briefly in a round of applause for the conference organizers. Now, as you heard from my bio just there, my main area of research is, depending on what branding we want to use, either law and economics or empirical legal studies. Essentially, I'm interested in the use of data to try to study why countries adopt different laws and then the efficacy of those laws once they adopt them. And it's then exciting for me to see the empirical legal studies community grow both in the United States but also spread around the world, to see more people that are interested in law using data to research these important questions. Now, part of the reason why I'm excited about the expansion of empirical legal studies is that I think that empirical legal studies has the opportunity to be something that's important and distinct from just general economics or political science or other quantitative social science. And here's what I mean. In economics and political science, the credibility revolution, which is the idea that we should pay more attention to research design so that we can have more credible causal estimates of the phenomena that we're studying, has, for very good reasons, spread like wildfire. And we understand the importance of trying to take causal identification seriously if we're going to be making causal claims. Now, the effect that has had, though, is to push most social science researchers to try to study questions where the independent variable of interest, the phenomena that they're studying, has plausible random variation. That is, there are some people that are treated and some are controlled in a causal sense. Now, here's the problem for law. First, many legal rules strive for near universal application. And second, they're frequently not randomly assigned. Instead, they're the product of deep thought, which means that the adoption of the legal rules themselves are endogenous. Right? The result, then, is many core questions that I think are the most important questions about what impacts economic growth, the spread of human rights, human prosperity, are left alone by so many social science researchers. Core questions about contract rights, about legal systems and institutional design, economists don't even bother writing papers about because the identification might not pass muster. The result is we'll have 100 papers on minor differences studying the minimum wage and essentially 0 papers on studying core questions of constitutional design. The result is that if you're someone that's interested in empirical legal studies, the most important questions for countries trying to figure out what to do to prevent growth or to prevent human flourishing are being left alone, and more of us should be writing papers on that. Now, that doesn't mean when we write these papers that we should free ourselves about considerations of causal inference, but instead what it means that often we have to use a mixed method approach, bringing evidence from different sources, trying to be careful about the arguments that we're making, and find ways to make credible arguments about what institutions are that matter and how they can have impacts on things that we care about. Now, the line of research I'm going to be talking to tonight is a line of papers that have now a second book with my colleague Mila Versteeg, where the core question that we've been trying to understand are what are the impact of different constitutional design choices that countries make. But for this, which is a book that we're just finishing about why constitutions fail, the question is not just about one provision or another. It's about the idea of constitution writing and the impact that adopting a new constitution has. Now, to explain the research, I thought I'd start with a story of constitutional drafting. And this story starts in Tunisia in 2010. So in December 2010, a fruit vendor that was living in a city in southern Tunisia was being harassed repeatedly by the police. So this is a guy that's selling fruit from a cart, and day after day after day, the police would come and try to demand a bribe of him. Now, this is someone that's barely making ends meet, can't support his family, and finally he feels pushed to the edge, and unfortunately, tragically, he lit himself on fire. Now, that fire, that self-immolation, is the spark that ignited the Arab Spring, the protest movement that began in Tunisia and then spread across the region to countries throughout the Middle East, into places like Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, etc. All started from this one incident in Tunisia. What happened then, though, was within Tunisia in early 2011, Ben Ali, the long-term president and autocratic dictator, decides to flee. The protests in the streets get so strong that he decides not to stay. So the dictator leaves, and people celebrate this moment that now it's the case that Ben Ali is no longer there. What do they do in response? They start a process to draft a new national constitution. They have an ambitious goal that the Constitution is going to be drafted that includes rights for minorities, includes rights for religious minorities as well, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other civil and political rights that the country had previously had denied. Now, this process goes on for several years without a successful constitution being drafted. Finally, a group of 4 organizations that called themselves the Quartet, a group of the Bar Association, that is the lawyers of Tunisia, a group of human rights organizations, labor unions, and a group of civil society organizations come together. They take control of the political process and come up with a grand compromise to adopt a new ambitious constitution that's going to radically reform the Tunisian state. Now, in 2014, the members of the quartet were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This is them receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo for their efforts. At the time, the constitution that came out of this process was widely applauded. Academics, scholars, civil science organizations said, this is the things happening the right way. And people pointed to the things that had taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the US had used military power to topple regimes and then imposed a new constitution, as doing things the wrong way. Instead, what occurred in Tunisia was people took to the streets, they overthrew their dictator, they got together and they drafted an ambitious new constitution, and it's something that we should celebrate. Now, let me contrast that with what happened in one of the other Arab Springs countries, Morocco. So Morocco, after in early 2011, at the start, just a month after the Tunisian movement, well, it's about 2 months later, they have the February 20th movement, where people in Morocco took to the streets as well. Morocco is a country that has a monarch, they have a king, and they demanded constitutional change. Now, instead of fleeing like Ben Ali, the dictator in Tunisia, did, instead, the king of Morocco went on national TV and said, I hear you. In response to this, we're going to reform our constitution and we're going to make changes. For instance, those changes included allowing the parliament to dissolve itself and the request of the prime minister and call elections without the king having to do so. But the king, importantly, left himself in charge of the military and in charge of the national religion and a range of other things. In other words, it's not a complete devolution of power. This was then criticized as being too slow and not ambitious enough, but it was enough to send people home from the streets. So what happened? So here's first the change in what's widely used democracy index that tries to measure countries on a scale on this index from 0 to 1, where 1 is supposed to be completely democratic and 0 is completely autocratic. Now, you can see the 2010 marker from when the Arab Spring occurs. So Tunisia has this massive upcreak, and then in 2019 and 20, it falls back off. So what happens in Tunisia so that it falls back off? Well, Tunisia, in the period from 2014 through 2019, had economic and political stagnation. They couldn't figure out how to get their new institutions to work. GDP collapses. The country goes into a repeated period of national strikes. In response to this, they decide in their election in 2019, when they're electing a new president, to turn to the country's most important constitutional law professor. Now, this is shocking to me that anyone could think a constitutional law professor could solve any problem, but that's what they do, and what he does is immediately push through a new autocratic constitution to give himself power. So as you can see, the experience of Tunisia is they become more democratic and then they fall back off. Meanwhile, Morocco, as you see, basically the same. The king keeps the power. So what you might think then is that Morocco doesn't improve at all. Tunisia at least tried. All right, here's the graph you should really care about. This is the change in GDP per capita in response to what takes place in the Arab Spring. Now, in Tunisia, what you see, the country is growing in GDP per capita. It gets to the Arab Spring, the growth completely halts. It disrupts the country's progression of continuing to have economic growth and economic prosperity. For instance, essentially, this period of political turmoil killed off some of their industries where there were factories based in Tunisia that supplied parts to Italy or France. It killed off the tourist industry. A range of their important industries fall off a cliff after this period. Morocco, on the other hand, continues growth, and by 5 or 6 years later, the difference that's occurred between the two is simply undeniable. And this is what led to Tunisia welcoming an autocrat to come back and get rid of that democratic constitution that had been so widely praised. This was a popular act that made that leader more popular in Tunisia to get rid of their democratic constitution. Finally, third outcome I'll show you, which is human rights. So this is a widely used measure called the Human Rights Score, created by a political scientist named Christopher Ferris. And with the Human Rights Score, it's a latent variable index that takes 13 different measures of human rights and tries to combine them into a single score, where 0 is average, +1 is 1 standard deviation better, and -1 is 1 standard deviation worse than the world average. Now what you see is they're both doing okay in the periods before the Arab Spring. Neither are great. But Morocco slowly progresses in the period after, where Tunisia stays flat. In other words, the experiment in Tunisia 5 years later has not only didn't produce gains in democracy or in human rights, but it led their economy to stagnate. In the meantime, Morocco, that has more gradual changes, economy pulls away from Tunisia in the process. Now, of course, what you might be thinking is that at this point, it's easy to find one example of a success story and one example of a failure of major constitutional reform. But the bold claim that I would make to you is that this is not a cherry-picked story. Instead, this is a very common story of constitutional reform, and that far too often major constitutional change is associated with exactly the outcomes that I just showed you. And that's the case that I want to make to you tonight. Major constitutional reform frequently leads to economic stagnation with no benefit to politics or human rights to show for it. So for instance, if you think of many of the major high-profile constitutional reform movements that have taken place over the last 30 years, for instance, constitutional reform movements like the one that took place in Russia at the fall of the end of the USSR, or for instance, maybe the high-profile success story that people pointed to of ambitious constitutional change, South Africa after apartheid falls and Nelson Mandela becomes president and they adopt a new constitution in 1996 that I think at the time was the hope of the world. Or for instance, I already mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan constitutions that were adopted in the wake of war. You can take any of the Latin American examples, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, similar stories. And instead, what you end up seeing is patterns that look like this. So what I'm going to start is showing you the global average. So on this graph, which is for some reason very fuzzy on this slide, the x-axis that you cannot read is the rate at which countries reform their constitution. And so this is the rate of replacement. So if you replace your constitution more times, you're further along to the right of the y-axis. And on the left is that democracy measure that I mentioned before. What you see is a clear negative correlation. Constitutional change is associated with lower movements when you look in the aggregate cross-country data. Here's the GDP result. This is the one that is truly terrible. Countries that change their constitution more have notably worse GDP per capita. And then third, here's that human rights measure that I showed before, also a negative correlation, right? across whether or not you're looking at countries' levels of democracy, economic growth, or human rights, more frequent constitutional change, that is, the more times you replace your constitution, you have worse outcomes on these measures. Now, at this point, everyone in the room that has some background in empirical analysis or empirical research should be thinking to themselves, is this at all causal or is it all correlation? Because what I am showing you are just correlations, right? There is no claim at any causal identification or any causal research strategy at all. It's just a negative correlation between these outcomes. And it's also easy to tell ourselves or easy to believe that countries that are already in bad positions, that already have bad economic situations, that have unstable political systems, of course they're rewriting their constitutions. This is one of the few tools that you have. And of course those countries are already worse off, and it should be unsurprising that they have worse economic growth or worse protection of human rights. That's why they're drafting new constitutions in the first place. But the bolder claim is to say it's not just that countries that rewrite their constitutions have worse GDP on average, but perhaps this idea of radical constitutional change is associated with these negative outcomes. So that's what I want to explain. So unfortunately, this story that I've been telling is what Mila and I call the tragedy of constitutional replacement. This common story is unfortunately one that is a tragedy, and like many tragedies, it takes place in 3 acts. So what are those 3 acts that tell the story that we just explained in the Tunisia and the Morocco example that I'm also arguing to you is a common example? So Act 1 of our story is this, which is that people go from crisis to constitution making. So what do I have in mind? Now, countries' national constitutions, their national charters, are one of their most important political documents, core to their legal system. And these documents then set up whether or not they're going to have a monarchy or a dictatorship, a parliament or presidential system, how it's going to be structured, et cetera. Now, around the world, though, many countries have adopted multiple constitutions. So for instance, you see that the United States or Canada, they just have one constitution. So they're not frequently readopting new constitutions. But other countries try adopting constitutions and again. So for instance, in this graph, the darkest color of red is countries that have adopted between 15 and 33 constitutions, which includes Bolivia, Venezuela. It's too small to see on this map. The country that's adopted the most new constitutions is the Dominican Republic. But many countries again and again adopt new constitutions. Now, in fact, the average constitutional length is just 25 years, which is interesting for at least American scholars of this, comparative constitutional law. Because famously, when the US Constitution was written, and the United States' Constitution is the oldest constitution still in effect, the United States Constitution at the time, Thomas Jefferson said that he thought that constitutions should be rewritten every generation, that every generation should throw away the rules of their forefathers and themselves sit down and write what they want their rules to be. Now, Madison, one of the other founding fathers and principal drafters of the US Constitution, said this is a terrible idea. The idea that you would start from scratch every generation is truly awful. Think of all the work that you'd have to do to rewrite your Constitution. Well, it turns out, as a descriptive matter, Jefferson was right. On average, countries throw away their Constitution once a generation and rewrite it. Unfortunately, as a prescriptive matter, it's too bad that Madison wasn't right, because as what we're going to explain is this doesn't work very well. But on average, countries' constitutions last 25 years. So over time, this is the total number of constitutions that have been drafted. Roughly 800 national constitutions have fully gone into effect around the world. And so what this means that many of these constitutions adopting them again and again, and sometimes in predictable bunches. So for instance, at the end of World War II, after a period of decolonization in 1960s, after the fall of the USSR in 1990, et cetera. Now, there's one trend that I would like to point out here at the end of this graph, which is that constitution making in the last 25 years normally ends in failure. So for instance, the Chilean story that you're probably familiar with is far too common. It turns out in the social media age, drafting a new constitution is proven near impossible. So the rate at which constitutions being drafted around the world has fallen off a cliff. But in general, constitution drafting is a common thing. Now, why does it happen? Part of our research that we've shown in this and other work is that there's typically a major triggering event these can be categorized in different ways. We focused on breaking countries down into 7 kinds of triggering events. So there's a revolution, a major protest movement, a civil war, a coup d'etat, something that pushes countries to do this, right? So it's not that countries very often have things that are going around completely smoothly. Their GDP is growing, their political system is working well, and they decide, hey, let's throw away our constitution and start again. To be clear, it's happened, but it's extremely rare. It's normally when something is going wrong that this takes place. Now, here's one way to visualize how bad that's going. So what this is showing you is those same 3 variables. On the left is the democratic score. On the middle panel is GDP per capita. And on the far right panel is the human rights score. And the line, the dotted line in the middle is, to start with, comparing countries to the global average in the same year in the 5 years before they draft a constitution. So for instance, for Tunisia, their constitution goes into effect in 2014. The 5 years before would be 2013, 2012, 2011, et cetera. So this is the before picture of an event study, right? So these are the 5 years before. And it's comparing Tunisia in 2014 to the global average in 2014 for levels of democracy, GDP per capita, and human rights score. And what it shows you is in the 5 years before countries draft constitutions, compared to the global average of countries in those same years, they are notably worse, right? So this is not a country that is doing well when it decides to draft a new constitution. Next, here's another way to look at the same graph. This, however, is taking countries that draft a new constitution, and instead of comparing them to the global average, it's subtracting their score in the 5 years before from that country's own average. So for instance, you take Tunisia's average GDP per capita, and then from that you subtract what its GDP per capita is in the 5 years before. So this is looking at a country, not comparing them to the rest of the world, but comparing them to themselves. And what's showing you is, compared to yourself, you're worse in the 5 years before you adopt a constitution. Now, here's putting those 2 things together. So you subtract away the mean from the world in that year and your own mean, and we look at the same graphs. And what you see is countries are not only they're worse, but they're falling off. You see these periods of decline in GDP per capita, decline in human rights before. Now, for people in this room, the thing that I just walked you through, first looking at a country compared to the global average, then looking at a country compared to its own average, and then subtracting both of the things at the same time, that's just walking you through the steps mechanically of what a panel regression is that has either a difference in difference or 2-way fixed effects that has year fixed effects and country fixed effects, right? But saying it in a simpler way, what you're seeing is once you control for the year and the country, that you see a notable decline in the 5 years before countries have adopted constitutions. So Act 1 then is to say that countries, when they have these triggering events, coup d'etats, revolutions, political protest movements, and things start to go wrong, their GDP is crashing relative to the world, their human rights are crashing relative to the world, that leads them from that moment to say, let's draft a new constitution, just as people called for in Morocco in 2011, in Tunisia in 2010, and in Chile in 2019, right? Major protest event. I know, let's write a new constitution to solve this. Now, Act 2 is when you go to actually start drafting. And during this moment when the drafting occurs, the people have come together in some way and they've picked up the pen, right? Now, to illustrate this example, I thought I'd talk more explicitly about the Chilean case that many of us probably know quite well. So in October 2019, the Santiago rising of metro fares leads to a protest movement that sweeps across first Santiago and then Chile more generally. This leads then to a political compromise where the president and the major political parties say, in response to this demand for change, we'll start a process to draft a new constitution. This is agreed to in late 2019. Now, of course, COVID intervenes in March 2020, which slows down the process, but Chile still then has elections to set up a constitutional assembly. After people have all taken to the streets, they set up a constitutional assembly that goes off the rails a little bit, but people draft a new constitution. Then people go and take to the streets to vote on it and to try to decide in a referendum whether or not to have this new constitution. Now, this presented a great opportunity for those of us interested in constitutions to study it. So, for instance, I made multiple trips during this period to Chile to try to understand what was going on, and Mila and I commissioned a nationwide survey in Chile to try to ask research questions relative to this research, and that we conducted it. This is showing you all of the polls that were that took place about people's response to the first constitution in Chile that was drafted, that was up for referendum in September 2022. And where in the timeline of where our poll fell. So we conducted this nationwide survey about a week and a half before people had to vote in September 2022. The green is showing you the people that were voting in favor of the new constitution. The red is the people that were opposed. The yellow is undecided. What this is also showing you is not only we were one of the later nationwide surveys conducted in Chile, but our results just are basically consistent with all the other survey results. So we tried to have a nationally represented survey, and it basically worked out, and we got the same results that ended roughly where the actual result was. But here's the question I wanted to show you from this. Even though the Constitution is voted down by 2/3 of people vote against the referendum in Chile for the first constitutional process. 2/3 of people vote against, which is also in our survey what people said they were going to do. So in our own sample, 2/3 of people say, no, we're going to vote this survey down. 75% of people in our survey said more constitutional rights are better. And we asked this question in several different ways. We got at it. People think the more things you put in a constitution, the better off you are when it comes to rights. People don't recognize trade-offs. We even ran survey experiments with people where we tried to get at this phenomenon of whether or not they believe there's trade-offs more. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details, but just to explain, roughly what we said to people is we asked about healthcare spending, and then we gave them hypothetical questions where more rights are included in the Constitution, and then asked how likely it is that you think that healthcare spending can be maintained. The number of rights in the Constitution seems to have no impact in people's minds on how much you can spend on healthcare. In other words, if you say there's a right to healthcare and a right to education and a right to Social Security and a right to everything, people still seem to think that you can spend the same amount on everything, right? There's no trade-offs in people's mind when you ask them about rights. We did the same thing with gender equality. We said, how many more rights are in the Constitution about other kinds of rights, religious rights, indigenous rights, et cetera? Is there any trade-off with gender rights? No, right? People seem to think more rights is better, even if you don't like this Constitution, and there won't be trade-offs along the way. Now, that phenomena, though, that I think that was experienced in Chile is a broader trend. The result is when new constitutions are drafting, frequently it includes radical change that expands the numbers of rights dramatically, but not just the number of rights, also the institutions within the country are frequently radically shifted. So here's one illustration of that. We got together a group of 12 comparative constitutional law scholars around the world, and we said, what are the parts of constitutions that are the most important, right? So for instance, to illustrate, there's a major data project called the Comparative Constitutions Project that codes the details of national constitutions. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Tom Ginsberg, is one of the people running this, along with Zach Elkins at the University of Texas. They now have 1,200 variables that they code for national constitutions. That's a lot of different variables, including like, does your constitution mention a national bird, right? That doesn't matter. But does your constitution have an independent commission to run your elections? Or does your constitution provide for term limits for its president? Those things probably matter. So what we tried to do is ask people about the core things, which of them matter. And we ended up with a list of about 75 provisions where people consistently rated as highly important. And these are about the structure of government. But here's the key thing. What this is showing you, it's just countries organized from countries that have had the fewest core constitutional changes on the left to countries that have had the most changes to these core 75 things on the right. And it's then showing you, so that the countries on the far left have essentially had no changes to these core provisions, and the countries on the far right have had over 125 changes to 75 provisions. In other words, they're often changing it back multiple times. And the light green color is saying whether or not this occurred through amendment, and the dark green color is whether or not it occurred through constitutional replacement. The pattern that you should pick up on here is that countries that change these core things about their constitutions a lot, it's that they do it through constitutional replacement. In other words, just like in Chile in 2019 or in Tunisia in 2024, once you start a constitutional drafting assembly, people are not modest in their thinking. They think we need radical change. We need to do something big. After all, we had social unrest. We had a dictator. We had a civil war. We had some other crisis. It's time to throw away our institutions and rewrite new ones, right? And so that's the pattern that you see. That's not cabin just to one country here or one country there. You see it around the world. Constitutional replacement is frequently associated with radical change. You see the same pattern, not just with the institutions, but with rights. So to start, this is just showing you the number of rights included in constitutions over time. For instance, in 1945, the average number was something like 18. In the time since then, the average number now is like 44. So it's more than doubled the number of rights in constitutions. And the highest, for instance, is Ecuador, that has like 80 constitutional rights, right? And so the number of constitutional rights, especially for new constitutions that are drafted and adopted, go up and up and up and up, right? So here's another way of looking at this data. Of the current constitutions, so you go around the world, you take the US Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, the Chilean Constitution that's currently in effect, and look at the number of rights that they have there, and when was the first time that they appeared, right? So for instance, in the United States, when did the freedom of speech appear? Or when did the right to vote for women appear, et cetera? 45% of those rights are in your first constitution, 40% are from replacement, and only 12% are from amendment. When countries add rights to their constitution, at a huge rate, it's when they replace their constitution. In other words, the moment of constitutional replacement, it leads to a huge number of rights. This is that same graph before, numbering countries that had the most change to their number of constitutional rights from left to right, stacking up the graph and showing you again that constitutional replacement is where this comes from, which is sort of the middle purple color. All right. The way to think of it is this. One of a scholar that you know, Sebastian Soto, who's a Chilean constitutional law scholar that was one of the drafters in the second process of the Chilean constitutional reform, explained it to me as this. The problem is that once you decide to write a new constitution and you pick up a pen, it's impossible to put down. So in other words, you have a crisis, you decide to write a constitution, but in that moment, people are not modest, they are not cautious, and they are not gradual. They think, how can I become my country's Thomas Jefferson, my country's James Madison? How can I rewrite my country's history through constitutional change? They think big, right? Now, that's Act 2 of the story. Act 3 is unfortunately where the story turns to tragedy, which is the bigger that people think, the worse it tends to go. So, for instance, to study this, the thing that we do, is to try to take the set of constitutional replacements that took place in the post-war period. So we're looking at data from 1945 to 2019. So this includes all of the new constitutions that were adopted. And for this analysis, we throw away your first constitution. In other words, we're looking at your second, your third, your fourth constitutions, right? When you replace your constitution, what happens during this period? So we have something like 350 events of constitutional replacement that take place during this period, right? Now, here's looking at the democracy index that I showed you before. This is 4 different event studies that use 4 different samples. I don't need to explain the details here in detail, but the key fact is that the, everything to the left of the event study is what I showed you before. That's the exact same graph that I walked you through how we created it, which is that you're subtracting out your fixed effects and country fixed effects, and then seeing what the pattern is in the 5 years before. And then you're seeing what happens after. Now, the pattern is that countries are on a decline in their level of democracy before they adopt a new constitution, and then go back up to where they were before. In other words, it gets you back to your baseline for your level of democracy relative to yourself and the rest of the world, but you don't make big gains beyond that. So it's not as if you shoot up to being wildly democratic on a way that's super off-trend in the years before. Now, those event study graphs are just showing you the 5 years before, but when we extend our analysis to look further at 5, 10, or up to 20 years, we basically get the same result. Constitutional replacement is not associated with wild changes in countries' levels of democracy, right? Okay, that's point 1. Here's the GDP graph, which to me is the most important. And let's focus on the upper left corner here, which is when we look at our sample of all the events we can look at. And what you see, everything on the left end of the event study is exactly the graph that we looked at before that shows you what takes place in the 5 years before countries adopt a new constitution. Here's what you see. Countries are declining before they adopt a new constitution. But after they adopt a new constitution, there's no bounce back in the first 5 years. Countries' levels of GDP per capita and GDP growth doesn't get back to where their own baseline is. Instead, they stay below that baseline afterwards. Now, here's when you look at the graph that's really concerning, though. This is 5, 10, and 20 years out. Actually, 20 years out, you're worse than any comparison set. In other words, your GDP growth doesn't improve over an extended period. Now, finally, here's the human rights scores. What this is showing you is a similar pattern. You decline, and then that decline arrests in the 5 years after constitutional adoption. In other words, it doesn't seem to improve. And then here's the 5, 10, and 20 years out. Human rights actually seems to get worse over a 20 years period of adopting constitutions. Now, here's what I can now say to you about what we can say about the causal identification. At least in the raw data, you can rule out the possibility pretty easily that adopting a new constitution is associated with, on average, big positive changes. What you are left with, in favor of drafting constitutions, it is possible that the decline would be even worse without the new constitution, right? That is, I showed you that the GDP loss stops at this point and doesn't bounce back, but we don't know, for instance, if a country that chose to adopt a new constitution, Tunisia or Afghanistan, whatever these examples we want to look at, of which there's huge numbers around the world, maybe it's the case if they hadn't done that, things would be worse off, right? And that's the possibility. But at least what this should do is give us a sense of caution. As lawyers, as economists, as people that talk to constitutional drafters, we might be more accurate if we say, look, you can go through this reform process. It's possible it will stop the bleeding. But if your vision is that your country is going to be rich and prosperous and more equal overnight because you changed your political document, we don't have many success stories that look that way. Now, why is that? So far I've just made an empirical claim to you that new constitutional change is a tragic one that is not associated with improved economic outcomes. Why is that? Now, since this is an empirical conference, and this is the part of our book that is all words and no graphs, I thought I'd just briefly explain the argument to you very quickly, but not emphasize this. We think that it's 3 problems that happen after you adopt a new constitution. The first is implementation problems. Now, implementation problems, by this I mean the text of the Constitution is clear of what it wants you to do, but it's just difficult to actually pull off. Let me give you one example. South Sudan, the world's youngest country, adopted a new constitution in 2013. And the advice that it got was that federal systems, like the United States or Brazil, work pretty well. And so the idea then is that maybe that South Sudan should have a federal system, and there should be 13 states with 13 state capitals. And those state capitals should have a court and a legislature, et cetera. All right. Those didn't exist. They still don't exist, right? Because there isn't the money, there isn't the resource, there isn't the time, there aren't roads connecting these places. But it was a vision. What if we were a federal republic? But implementing that is hard, right? In the same way in Tunisia, for example, the 2014 constitution called for a new constitutional court. It never got set up. It just can be difficult to actually build the new institutions that are promised. They take time, they take money, they take human capital, and there's only so many things that you can realistically prioritize and do at once. So it may be the case you start a new constitution and you set up one of the institutions, but not all 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that are promised in the Constitution. It's not straightforward to do. It takes time to do. And then if your solution is every 5 or 10 or 15 years to throw that away and try again with a different set of institutions, you just have to start over. So now we got rid of this court and we started a new court. It'll be different. And before you can get that one off the ground and the judges picked, you got to start a new process. So that's implementation problems. The second is what we call liquidation problems. So liquidation is a term of art in US constitutional law, where James Madison, when I told you earlier that he had this debate with Thomas Jefferson, where Jefferson said, let's rewrite a new constitution every generation, and Madison said, that's a horrific idea because a constitution needs to be liquidated. And what he meant by that is that there will be terms in the Constitution that are vague, that are unclear, and that you need to form some sort of convention or consensus. For the economists in the room, you have to figure out what the equilibrium is going to be of behavior, right? How you respond to what this rule is. Right? And in those situations, it takes time for that consensus to develop. And if you change the wording and you change the some vague provision from vague provision A to vague provision B, you have to figure this all out again. Now, those customs can evolve over time, even if you don't replace your constitution. And in the United States, for instance, there's a variety of political customs that have changed over our 240 years of having a constitution. But a new constitutional draft means that almost all of the provisions have to be reliquidated. You have to figure out how to implement these ideas in practice. What happens when all these unintended things happen? Now, here's the final problem. The final problem is that too often, new constitutions aren't just a list of how many senators you'll have and how long the president will serve. What's embedded within it is an idea of social transformation. This country should be different. It should be more racially equal. It should be more economically equal. It should be more religiously tolerant, whatever it may be. but grand visions of social transformation, where one group thinks that it should happen and the other group thinks that this is a bad idea, inevitably lead to situations where many people are rooting against the Constitution to succeed. They wish that it wouldn't, right? And so you create a scenario where that social transformation itself creates opposition to the legal reforms. And because of that, then, it grinds the institutions to a halt. People are trying to gum up the works, to throw the parliament, make sure that a government can't be formed, that a court can't have the judges sit, et cetera. And so the act of social transformation makes it then difficult to have a situation where you actually implement the ideas that you had. And between these things, what you frequently see in the years after new constitutions are drafted is paralysis, right? It just takes time to sort these things out and to work their way through. All right, now, everything I've said so far has been a bit of a depressing story. As I said, a tragedy, one that lawyers don't want to hear. Everyone wants to think that constitutions are the $100 bill on the sidewalk. When there's a problem that goes wrong in the Middle East or in South America or anywhere in the world, what if we draft a new constitution and that can make things better and lead to a country that is more equal, more just, more fair, and more likely to have economic growth? Now, to be clear, the thing that we should be rooting for is not stagnation. It's not lack of change. And my favorite argument for this is an economist named Timur Kuran that teaches at Duke, wrote a fantastic book called The Long Divergence. And in The Long Divergence, the problem that he looks at is that in the difference between the Middle East and Europe in its economic prosperity. What he argues is until roughly the year 11 or 1200, that the Middle East and Europe are about equally rich. That is, people that were living in Baghdad or in Paris in the year 1200 would have, on average, had roughly the same amount of consumption, the same number of calories, the same life expectancy, et cetera. And then what happens is what he calls the long divergence. Europe just starts pulling away and away and away, right? So the core question is, what caused this? What led Europe to get richer and richer and richer, and the Middle East to stagnate and have it pull away from it? And what he argues is laws. What he says is the dominant legal forms for much of the Middle East, which derives from medical law, was the form of the waqf or the fatwa, which are a kind of legal document that can't be evolved and can't change. So someone sets up what the university is going to look like in a given city, they put down a charter, and there it is, no change, dead hand control. At the same time, Europe is just finding more and more ways to experiment. And so they start in the UK, for example, or in Amsterdam or in other countries. They set up a parliament, then they dissolve it. They have a parliament that works one way, then another. They allow for corporate personhood, then they don't. It's just constant experimentation and change. That experimentation and change is what leads to the economic growth. Right? So in other words, the solution cannot be, once you have a constitution, nothing changes. Right? This is our rule forever. But I've also told you that radical institutional change is often associated with 20-year periods of low economic growth. So what do we do? What do we take from this? Here's one final graph. Well, I'll skip the Iceland story. One final graph that, again, for some reason, is fuzzy on these slides. Here's this final graph, though, that you can see the trends even though you can't read the axes. It's the same three variables I've been showing you again and again. Far left is the democracy score, middle is GDP capita, and the left is the human rights score. And the x-axis is identical. Here's the variable that's now on the y-axis. The y-axis is now not the number of new constitutions you have or the rate at which you replace them per year as it was in the initial graphs. It's the rate at which you amend them per year. More constitutional amendments per year is associated with positive rises in democracy, positive rises in GDP, and positive rises in human rights. In other words, constitutional stagnation is a problem, but the solution that we have is the Moroccan solution. You reform some institutions. You don't get everything to change at once. You don't hope to be a different country overnight, but you find marginal changes that can improve the status quo without throwing away all of your institutions, all of your laws, and all of your practices. And at times this might seem like a story that's a little depressing, right? That we can't just rewrite a constitution and wish to be something new without serious costs. But we have the legal tools that we need that can make countries better. It's just one that we have to focus in many instances on gradual change instead of radical change. All right, with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Adam Zilton. Well, I think we have time for a few questions. Why don't we go for a round for 3 questions? Is that okay? And then you, yes, I think someone already showed.
Well, I mean, thank you for the very interesting talk. I have many questions, but I will restrict myself to one. And I was just curious if you looked at the a little bit in detail at the changes to the Constitution. So one intuition might be, you know, you can change rights and you can change institutional structure, and you can perhaps come up with measures that look at how different the institutional structure is before and after the redo, and does the quantity of that difference actually make a difference? And is it more the institutional structure, or do the rights cause the same problems? Because it seems to be that it's mostly an institutional capacity problem that we're creating, which would be on the structure side. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Great question. When we look at individual constitutional rights, so like just the right to healthcare, or just the right to education, or just the right to gender equality, and we have a whole series of papers and a prior book that are on like the effect of constitutional rights. And individual constitutional rights by themselves seem to have almost no impact on anything. And by that I mean, like, when countries adopt a right to healthcare, their life expectancy doesn't change, but neither does their medical spending. And so the same when countries adopt the right to education, they don't seem to spend more on teachers, and the literacy rates don't move. And also, one constitutional right doesn't show up as having impacts on GDP or democracy, these other sort of macro variables. However, when we look at countries that at the moment, we have a paper just looking at the moment you adopt your constitution, are you on the top like quartile or quintile of constitutional right change, like you add 20 rights at once? Adding 20 rights at once, something like that, is then associated with negative GDP growth. And so like it does seem that any one right doesn't move the GDP, but you add a whole bunch of stuff at once, and then that is associated with negative GDP. Here's the problem why I can't satisfyingly answer your question. The exact same cases, the exact same reforms where they add a ton of rights do a ton of institutional changes in those same constitutions. And so I would give you the exact same question if you look at the structural changes. And so it turns out that like radical reform goes hand in hand, more rights and more structural changes, and that package is associated with more rights, with like negative changes, but like the sample gets so thin when you try to like interact or break it down to see which is worse. And that we're talking about at that point, 20 cases or whatever. Now, personally, I believe the answer is that the structure matters and that it matters more. And then probably why I'm giving you a washy answer is that all of the confidence intervals overlap, so I can't say that confidently. Yeah.
So I thought you were going the direction of there are these crises that lead to drafted constitutional changes, and then some didn't get implemented and some did, which could then give you kind of a cleaner causal story. And curious if that was something you were able to explore or didn't. If so, why? Relatedly, I was thinking about John's presentation from 2 days ago on synthetic controls, and I wonder if there's anything that you're able to exploit there to get something a little bit more precise. There's this paper by Daron and Jim Robinson and Suresh on like democracy causing growth in the JPE, and I'm wondering if there's analogous research designs there for this problem of the effects of constitutions and changes. And then the final thing was just, your story was a lot about people. Like, oh, there's this person who wants to be like the next Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. But maybe there's certain people that are a little more modest. And I wonder if there's any way you're able to get data on that and sketch out your story a little bit more quantitatively.
Yeah. So on the first part of the question, as Daniel pointed out, is a great research design is to take all of the situations of the dog that didn't bite, the constitutions that were starting to be implemented but never were, and then look what happens. And the slide I skipped over right at the end was the Iceland 2008, which is roughly this story. Same as Chile. Iceland's the hardest hit country or one of the hardest hit countries of the great financial recession because they were so over-leveraged in the banking industry. It blows up terribly. They have this thing called the pots and pans revolution where people went to the streets banging pans in front of the parliament until they agreed to draft a new parliament, and then it's just never adopted. A little bit like Chile. And the thing I didn't then talk more about or show results is we've now collected, and actually my co-author Mila just presented this research for the first time at Stanford about 2 weeks ago. We've now got 120 cases of that, where what we define as formal drafting processes. So this isn't just like a law professor has a conference where they say, let's draft our imaginary constitution, where there's a formal process, there was the opportunity to adopt it, and it was denied. And then we're looking at exactly this, comparing the adoption and non-adoptions. I'm not confident enough in what our initial results are to show them right now, but I think the non-adoptions come out a little better. So that's the first part of the story. Now, the second part of the story was, so there's this great paper that's Osmoglu, Robinson, Naidu, and who's the fourth author on it? Doesn't matter. And JP a few years ago, Does Democracy Show Growth? And they have this fantastic graph, figure one of the paper, I really recommend this paper, is they show this U-curve like this, where they say that basically democracies are associated with negative GDP growth for a while, and then it comes back up, and by 20 years, you're better off becoming a democracy, right? Now, in fact, the things that I showed you that I didn't explain in detail, that 5, 10, and 20 years later is adopting their exact lag lead research design, which they very helpfully put all of their code online so that we're able to recreate their exact research design, because I think that's the most sort of credible, high-profile, cross-country growth paper recently. The thing that makes it slightly difficult to do much beyond showing those initial graphs is that they consider becoming a democracy a binary event. And so they say you are or are not a democracy in their coding, and we're able to say you are or are not a constitution. We then try to break down some of the big changes, small changes, and like I said in response to the first question, and we see some results there. But that's I do think is a great research design. At least it's credible to build off of, which is exactly what we did. Another question, probably. I'm sure I didn't answer everything in either of those first two questions, but.
Hello. Fatih Kaya, Goethe University, Frankfurt. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question. I was wondering if you notice any difference in your data depending on how the constitutional right itself is recognized. And what I mean by that is I'm originally Albanian, and the Albanian government recognizes constitutional rights, but it recognizes such a way that it makes it the burden of the government to protect it, so it expands the power of the government. Whereas when I grew up in the United States, the first thing I learned is that Congress shall make no law restricting the power of the government. So I was wondering, is that expansionary vision for the right or a limiting vision for the right of the government shows any variation on the relationship between the data and GDP and the other factors? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a large amount of variation in the way that countries think about their rights actually being implemented. For instance, some countries will say there is a clause on the right to education. Will say there is a right to education, that education should be free from K through 12. Some constitutions will then have a sentence right after that saying, except limited to other constraints or something like this, right? They'll have a limitation in the right itself. Other constitutions will have another section of the Constitution where it imposes limits on the enforcement of the rights, where it says the following rights will be provided for subject to constraints or limits or capacity or something like this, right? So there'll be clauses that do this. In other countries, the Constitution itself doesn't provide this, but immediately the Supreme Court adopts forms of proportionality review where they say that we're going to balance these rights against each other. So it'll happen through the doctrine, not the document. And then in other rights still, the Constitution will say this right is judicially enforceable or it's not judicially enforceable. And courts will either take the Constitution up on that request or deny it. In other words, there's just considerable variation both within the document and within the legal practices within a country about how rights are recognized. And you end up just sprinting down this huge path. Now, I've explored one of those with Mila, but the other scholars have explored other paths. The one we focused on is courts. And I got to say, I'm pretty skeptical about courts' ability to implement constitutional rights because the best research on this, much of it is actually from South America, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Ecuador, where basically the Colombia evidence is the best. And we have a book we wrote, we had a chapter on it, where essentially the right to health care exists in the Colombian Constitution, which means that middle-class people use that then to sue to get expensive cancer treatment, and then that just redirects the budget of the government towards experimental treatments or things that are more expensive, but on ways that on net seem to be very regressive, moving people away from like progressive provision of these rights that might have been the idea in the first place. And so, that's the area I focused on, as the judicial administration of these rights, but the point being that there's just deep heterogeneity and I think a lot of different paths of research. The one thing I'll say on all of this research is it's always whack-a-mole, and here's what I mean. We wrote like a dozen papers saying that we can't find an impact of constitutional rights, and when we present these to constitutional law scholars, it's always the place we didn't look, right? And then whenever we look there, it's still not there. People are convinced there must be a form of right that you can write down in a specific way, then that's the example. But no lawyer seems to know the country off the top of their head where it happened, right? And so if it was the case that there was some just wild success story, they put the right to education in their constitution, and now everyone's much more literate than you'd expect from their GDP. That's the example I would love someone to know. And I don't know anyone that's off trend relative to GDP per capita due to its legal rights. And so that's why I'm sort of skeptical of the particular way that you could instantiate your rights that would just solve the problem.
I believe we still have some time for probably one question more.
I found very interesting your findings. I have a question regarding the finding about constitutional amendments having more likely of successful endurance than constitutional replacement. Are constitutional amendments equally distributed or equally likely among countries? Because based on Latin American countries' experience, some countries are more likely to modify their constitution through amendments rather than through replacement, whereas other countries more through replacement than amendment. So I was wondering if maybe there is something about specific countries' characteristic that has a better, I mean, it's not maybe the amendment, but the particularity of the countries that modify their constitution through amendment rather than replacement.
Yeah, okay. Great question. So there's this example that I really like in constitutional amendments, which is, so at the end of World War II, after the United States has dropped the 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and Japan surrenders, and the United States takes over the administration of Japan, General Douglas MacArthur is then in charge of drafting a new constitution for Japan. So the US military sets up the Japanese constitution. And MacArthur is from Alabama, and the constitution that he tries to base the most of this is the Alabama state constitution. And specifically, the Japanese amendment rule in the current Japanese constitution is like taken basically from the Alabama state constitution. Okay, now, Japan, that's the constitution is drafted in 1947, right? And so we're, whatever that is, 70 years later, no amendments. So the amendments hasn't changed. By the way, obviously, Japan has an externally imposed constitution by a controlling military presence that they have not changed in 70 years, and Japan's doing pretty well. And so shows you something about stability. However, Alabama is the most amended U.S. state constitution. Same formal rule about how you amend it, wildly different in the actual rate of amendment. And now, this is just one example, but what you see is there's many countries with the same formal rules about how to amend their constitution, and exactly as the question stated, very different actual practices about how frequently things are amended. And so it's not just that there's differences across country amendment rates, there's even within countries with similar rules, huge heterogeneity on how much amendment happens. The thing that I would add to that, though, is that not all amendments are created equal. There are some amendments that are very minor technical changes that probably have no impact on anything we can measure, GDP, democracy, and even the people that pass those amendments wouldn't expect them to. And there's other amendments that are so big that you might think of them as just a complete new moment. For instance, in the United States, we often talk about whether or not the post-Civil War amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that abolished slavery, created equal protection, et cetera, whether or not that should be even thought of as a new constitution, since it's just so wildly different than the first U.S. Constitution, that's not a crazy thought. Those amendments are not small things to our political system. But in our data, they show up as an amendment, not a new constitution. And so I think one area that this or other scholars should try to go to is trying to measure like the size of amendment to try to think about whether or not we should be comparing more apples to apples. There's like big constitutional replacement events versus big amendment events, small amendment events versus small replacements, which is something I'll say on the amendments we haven't yet tried to classify or look into further, but I think that's a great avenue for future research.
One last, okay, go ahead, very quickly.
Fantastic talk, Adam. Really, really very interesting and extremely persuasive. I did have one question. Have you looked at all at the right to abortion? I don't know whether other countries other than the United States have put that into their constitution, but the evidence that Steve Levitt and I put together for the United States was that you saw a very sharp decline in crime 20 years after the right to abortion was implemented in the United States. And then other papers have shown that when the right to abortion was instituted across Europe, you saw the same 20-year lag decrease in crime. But I don't know whether your work is limited to constitutional implementations of rights or expands to legislative implementation as well.
Yeah. So we have never specifically looked at the right to abortion. We look sort of one of two things. There's about a dozen rights we've looked at individually and written either specific papers or then a book that looked at them together after we've written these sort of individual papers. And then we've looked at like the total number. And so those are the two ways we've done it. And abortion is not one of the ones we ever looked at individually. Although, of course, for instance, in the Chilean constitutional reforms and a number of other countries where there's a tension between like a Catholic tradition and a secular energy in the country, it's one of the most hotly debated topics in those reform processes. But we've never looked at it. And I'll say beyond that is that there are, we look at like in most of this work, we've looked at the large C Constitution, that is the formal written document. So for instance, in the United States, like in 1973 in Roe v. Wade, the United States Supreme Court recognizes a right to abortion, which then in the Dobbs decision a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court takes away. But at no point did the like large C, the document that is called the Constitution, that's housed in the U.S. National Archives, no words are changed, right? And so we focus mostly, and most of our research on the large C Constitution. We have one or two papers where we try to look at small c, which gets very contested very fast, what counts as a small c right or not across countries. But I do think this is like a massive area of future research. One final point. So John, sitting here, is for those of you that were on his keynote on Monday night, is the world's leading expert on looking at, in the United States, on the impact of gun rights on homicide crime, a range of outcomes, and studying that. One note that's relevant to that is a paper that my colleague Mila, my co-author, had before we started writing together, was to show basically that almost every constitutional right in the world has become more common over time. So, X number of countries had a right to free press. Now it's a higher share. Right to religion, right to gender equality, whatever it is. There's one exception, which is the right to bear arms, which has become less common over time. And it's now just like, I don't remember, it's the US, Finland, and Algeria or something. It's almost no one left that recognizes this right, which I think is the world listening to John, hopefully, on whether or not it's a good idea. All right. And with that, I think we're done.
Thank you once again, Professor Arden Chilton, for your wonderful and inspiring talk. And thank you, everyone. And I think that now we go to the closing session with our organizers. So please.
Vamos dar início aqui à sessão de encerramento. Meu nome é Paulo, sou professor aqui do INSPER. Estou aqui na condição de anfitrião, né, desses dois eventos, nesse caso, nesse momento aqui, organizados aqui, tendo ao meu lado as pessoas que foram realmente responsáveis por colocar tudo isso de pé, né, a professora Maria Paula e o professor Ivan Ribeiro. O INSPER colaborou aqui, é por isso que nós estamos aqui nesse momento, né, para esse evento. Eu quero fazer um agradecimento aqui especial para os professores do INSPER que fizeram isso acontecer, o professor Ivar Hartmann, que está aqui, e também o professor Diego Arguelles, né, que foram essenciais nesse processo todo, além de todos os professores que participaram do comitê científico do INSPER e fora do INSPER, né? Tivemos um comitê assim amplíssimo durante esses eventos. Um comentário muito rápido sobre a experiência desses dois eventos. Eu acho que foi interessantíssimo ter os dois eventos juntos. Um dos eventos tem até uma característica, eu entendo, de um movimento que atraiu um conjunto muito grande de pessoas, no caso aqui, Direito e Políticas Públicas, que é um evento de essência acadêmica e também, eu diria, com uma intenção, com uma missão de transformação da política pública. Então, acho que tem uma característica muito interessante e complementar aos CELS, que tem, acho que, como principal característica buscar um rigor na capacidade de avaliação, de efeito de normas jurídicas, né, uma avaliação sobre, em termos empíricos, de realmente ter essa capacidade de poder predizer determinados efeitos, que é essencial para a elaboração de políticas públicas que sejam, de fato, eficazes. Então, tem uma complementaridade muito grande entre esses dois eventos. Foi muito interessante vê-los acontecer. Eu tenho certeza aqui que Ivan e Maria Paula, já vou passar a palavra para eles, estão muito felizes nesse momento por dois motivos, né? Porque viram o evento acontecer como era esperado e o sucesso do evento, e também porque terminou o evento, né? E agora, como organizadores, eu não sei se alguém aqui já participou desse processo de organizar eventos, é sempre uma satisfação especial quando você vê tudo concluído, que vai poder descansar e dormir tranquilamente. Eu peço, então, uma salva de palmas para os dois aqui. Vou começar aqui com a Maria Paula.
Bom, boa noite a todas as pessoas presentes. Boa noite, querido amigo Paulo Furquim, meu amigo e parceiro Ivan Ribeiro. Nós realmente estamos felizes, nós chegamos lá. Eu sei que você tem aí uma continuação amanhã, mas aquele congresso muito desafiador foi realizado e foi um sucesso. Eu posso dizer que foi extremamente bem-sucedido. Então, parabéns ao Ivan, que é o principal responsável por pôr a coisa de pé, né? Tudo aquilo que faz funcionar um congresso. Ele pôs a experiência, pôs aí a criatividade, mobilizou e eu, de meu lado, acho que congreguei, acho que soube reconhecer na rede de Direito e Políticas Públicas uma variedade de aptidões. Eu acho que você resume com muita felicidade. A rede de Direito e Políticas Públicas, ela tem essa vocação, eu sempre enunciei uma vocação aplicada, né? Então, eu dizia na fala de abertura que o nosso ponto de partida é ter reunido uma comunidade epistêmica, que não é só uma comunidade epistêmica, ela é uma comunidade profissional, e isso ficou muito claro com o formato, até com uma inovação importante que o Ivan trouxe. Então, essa comunidade epistêmica se reuniu e demonstrou, e esse é o 6º congresso, a evolução de toda a formulação, de toda a produção é notável. essa inovação, foram duas inovações. No formato do Congresso, foi a criação de uma sessão de relatos de pesquisa, que não existia, então é a apresentação de trabalhos mais longos, de trabalhos mais qualificados, e exatamente essa comunidade epistêmica, que é de pesquisadores, que é de pós-graduandos, muitas pessoas das carreiras jurídicas públicas, advocacia pública, juízes, juízas, promotores, apresentando trabalhos e com essa perspectiva de soluções e de sair dos limites estritos do direito formal para identificar problemas, criar soluções, mudar posturas, mudar perspectivas. E isso foi muito possível de ver, tanto nos relatos especiais, como nas duas sessões especiais da Rede Direito e Políticas Públicas, uma dedicada ao ensino, experiências de ensino em Direito e Políticas Públicas, e experiências de pesquisa em Direito e Políticas Públicas. E eu fiquei muito impressionada com aquilo que apareceu. Eu acho que é uma abordagem que se consolida, a abordagem de Direito e Políticas Públicas. E eu comentava com o John, antes de começar a palestra, aquilo que eu tinha tocado na fala de abertura, que é, quando nós fizemos uma grande pesquisa sobre o que existia de produção de fundos sobre direito e políticas públicas no mundo, a coleta revelou poucos autores se dedicaram profundamente ao tema. Tem um suíço, no fim dos anos 90, tem um americano, em Wisconsin, com quem eu trabalhei com ele em 2022, na Universidade de Wisconsin, e isso resultou num livro, na tradução da obra dele. Eu dizia que ele ficou muito espantado. O começo da conversa com o professor William Clune foi entender, porque essa coletânea que eu organizei, junto com duas pesquisadoras, que é a Gabriela Salles e a Isabela Ruiz, reúne artigos que ele escreveu nos anos 80 e 90. Então, ele mesmo ficou muito surpreso. Ele não fez escola, não tem continuadores, não tem discípulos, e terminou por ali a produção dele. E esse professor suíço também não teve escola, tem um sucessor que estudou uma parte do direito e políticas públicas, que é a legística, o processo de confecção da lei, e parou por aí. E eu vejo, então, que, de uma certa maneira, essa produção do Brasil, eu acho que eu me orgulho bastante disso, e o próprio Clune reconheceu isso. Quando ele quis entender o nosso interesse, ele quis conhecer o trabalho dos meus orientandos, e ele ficou muito impressionado de ver que aquilo tinha ido adiante. Então, eu acho que nós temos uma abordagem original, muito promissora, com uma comunidade que se engaja. Eu acho que ela tem uma vocação muito grande. Ela foi muito apoiada pela universidade. A USP, né, e a Faculdade de Direito, vai fazer 200 anos no ano que vem, está celebrando a existência de um trilho que pode se envolver na produção de soluções e com um engajamento para o país, que acho que é bastante interessante. Então, eu quero terminar com esse saldo muito positivo, com esse agradecimento. Certamente o Ivan vai fazer o agradecimento, os agradecimentos formais, que ele tem mais na cabeça, que agora eu já não tenho mais. Mas eu quero dizer que estou muito contente de estar aqui. Obrigada pela atenção de todos e vamos ao próximo.
Agradecer Paulo e Paula. Para começar, né, porque eu sempre saio para os agradecimentos, a gente sempre fica na lista que não pode esquecer ninguém, né? Mas enquanto Paula falava aqui, eu lembrava de uma aula que eu tive com Guido Calabrese, que era uma aula em que ele falava law and, né? E aí dizia por que a gente tem tanto desses law and economics, law and the society. A gente fez um seminário que era law and food, né? A coisa era realmente divertida, né? E aí o Guido, explicando isso de uma forma bastante didática, falou: olha, o que acontece é o seguinte, né? Quando você cria um movimento desse, a gente tem aqui nos Estados Unidos por volta de umas 200 faculdades de direito, se aquilo pega, você precisa de pelo menos uma professor daquela área. Então, isso garante carreira para bastante gente, né? Então, uma forma da gente adentrar numa carreira jurídica é conseguir fazer um law em alguma coisa para criar lá o teu cartóriozinho, né? E aqui no Brasil a gente gosta de um cartório, né? A gente realmente adora um cartório. E aí eu tenho a impressão que, se a gente se reunir 4 pesquisadores de direito, nós vamos ter 6 linhas de pesquisa, nós vamos ter 7 associações científicas e uma reprodução enorme. E eu percebo que, em alguma algumas áreas é difícil juntar gente. Eu, quando comecei a fazer pesquisa empírica em Direito, fazendo pesquisa quantitativa, há 25 anos atrás, quase, a gente não lotava um Fusca, e durante muito tempo a gente continuou não lotando um carro de 4 lugares. Né? E mais recentemente, eu comecei a ficar ecumênico. Né? Então, eu falo, olha, pesquisa empírica em Direito, Empirical Legal Studies, jurimetria, Law and Economics, tem um fundo que está muito próximo de teste de hipótese de forma rigorosa, através de métodos que implicam causalidade, implicam explicação, e um pouco além disso. E eu vejo essa possibilidade de sinergia, eu tenho estendido isso para outras áreas. Então, quando eu recebi a sugestão do nosso presidente da rede DPP, o Saulo Coelho, de fazer o evento, o 6º Congresso Brasileiro de Direito e Políticas Públicas, eu falei, Saulo, eu podia fazer, mas eu tenho que fazer um evento internacional grande, eu acho que dá para fazer junto. E não é uma questão de dividir despesa, de dividir local, algo assim, mas é porque eu vejo um projeto científico que integra direito e políticas públicas com pesquisa empírica em direito. Eu acho o direito descobriu a avaliação de políticas públicas quando a gente teve a alteração do 37, inserindo lá o parágrafo 16, dizendo que política pública vão ter que ser avaliadas. E aí, para muito jurista, a avaliação de política pública passou a existir no mundo. Né? Bem-vindo ao grupo que está estudando isso há 50 ou mais anos, né? Mas antes tarde do que mais tarde. Mas eu vejo nessa a ideia de se avaliar política pública uma das formas de aproximar a pesquisa empírica em direito do direito e políticas públicas. Então, mais do que um projeto de um evento, para mim o que aconteceu aqui foi o corolário de um projeto científico, de uma agenda de pesquisa que eu acho que integra as duas coisas. E do meu lado, né, porque quando você começa a fazer pesquisa quantitativa, você vira meio fanático daquilo, né? Então, só interessa se tiver lá uma regressãozinha. E eu comecei a ler Howard Becker, a ler esses sociólogos, eu gosto muito dos sociólogos americanos, que mostram que é possível fazer inferência a partir de uma pesquisa qualitativa. Eu comecei a ver a possibilidade, depois que eu entrei na Unifesp, que é uma universidade conhecida pela área de saúde, de ver o quanto as metodologias que são usadas em estudos clínicos, na sistematização de ensaios clínicos ou de relatos clínicos, pode servir para expandir um conhecimento. E foi um raciocínio que eu achei, em algo que eu sempre descrevo como a tese de livre docência da Maria Paula. Dizem que cada vez que eu falo isso, baixa um monte de gente lá na biblioteca da USP procurando a tal tese, e eu sempre esqueço de falar que é um livro, né? Enfim, mas eu vejo a aproximação, então, também na metodologia, em outros formatos, quer dizer, a ideia de fazer o teste empírico, estabelecer causalidade, e muito voltado para direito e políticas públicas. E esse ecumenismo, eu acho que vem também para a ideia de que a gente tem que congregar instituições. Eu sempre digo que a ciência é uma só. Às vezes você está falando, vamos fazer parceria com tal instituição. Eu falo, não, então vamos fazer parceria com eles, vamos fazer só aqui a gente. Eu falo, não, a ciência é uma só, e aí eu fico muito satisfeito de ter conseguido juntar a Unifesp, a USP e o INSPER fazendo isso, mas não só os três. A gente tem aí, a gente contou, eram 30 instituições e programas de pesquisa na nossa reunião da associação, dos associados à rede DPP. Então, quer dizer, eu acho que é esse esforço que congrega esforços em vários sentidos. Né? Eu queria fazer alguns agradecimentos, né? Quando a gente começa a agradecer as pessoas, eu chego à conclusão, não é possível, porque foi contar, está passando de 100 pessoas trabalhando no centro, então não é possível cumprimentar todo mundo. Eu vou fazer 2 agradecimentos, um que eu não fiz até agora, porque eu já citei nominalmente muitas pessoas, e me ocorreu que eu não citei nossos keynotes e os participantes de fora. Então, eu queria agradecer muito a presença do professor John, que, na verdade, já amigo de longa data, foi meu professor e agora coautor e amigo, professor Adam Tilton, a professora Fabiana Rocha. A desvantagem de você fazer um evento na sua própria cidade é que você é facilmente removido dele para resolver algum problema na sua instituição. Ela não está aqui, como eu não estive de manhã, resolvendo algum problema na universidade. Mas, professora Fabiana Rocha, eu queria agradecer outros participantes que poderiam ser os keynotes dessas sessões perfeitamente, professor Daniel Chen, a professora Corina Copete, a gente está fazendo esforço de de estender o movimento de pesquisa empírica em direito para além do Brasil, para a América Latina. Então, o Instituto CELS Latinoamérica foi criado para continuar fazendo o evento, promoveu uma das mesas, que é a mesa que discutiu a independência dos juízes, onde a gente teve aqui, aí agradeço nominalmente, a professora Azul Aguilar, do México, professores Herman e professora Castanhola, respectivamente de San Andrés e de Torquato de Tella, e o professor Villalonga, da PUC do Chile. Além de estar aqui, acho muito produtiva a conversa com eles para a gente estender isso para outros estados. Eu mencionei o professorado Anchen e a Corina Copete tiveram na sessão especial da própria Society for Empirical Legal Studies, fez questão de ter uma sessão especial para mostrar que não que há uma cooperação, que é um projeto amplo de pesquisa. E no nome desses, eu já agradeci muito aqui a Maria Paula e desenvolveu fazer o evento é um trabalho grande, né? A gente percebe que a gente não se dá mais bom dia. A gente fala, Ivan, pagamos aquela conta, Ivan, tal coisa. Paula, a gente está com os livros da editora, os compromissos agora eles são dispensados faz alguns dias. Vamos ver se a gente volta ao bom dia, boa tarde, que esteve você. Mas agradecer muitíssimo a Maria Paula pela parceria. É uma parceria que eu diria, Paulo, que é intelectual. Eu, quando vi tua tese livre de docência, eu falei, aqui tem... não era um método, eu falei, aqui tem econometria. Assim, eu gostei do brinquedinho que eu vi ali. Eu queria fazer um agradecimento formal também para as instituições. Eu sempre faço, toda a oportunidade que eu tenho, para a CAPES e para o CNPq, que estão patrocinando. É muito importante a gente ter órgãos de fomento, que tem esse fomento diretamente para o pesquisador, porque a gente sabe, às vezes, o trabalho que você conseguir fazer algo de uma instituição e o quanto você ter esse tipo de fomento, por mais escasso que seja, por mais difícil e trabalhoso que seja, o quanto isso é importante para a independência científica, né? Agradecer o Fundo de Direitos Difusos. O Fundo de Direitos Difusos é muito pouco creditado nas coisas que ele financia, e eu acho que passou a ser uma agência importante em preservação de patrimônio histórico, mas também em várias outras dimensões, inclusive produção científica. Em termos de patrocínio, especificamente, o INSPER, além de ter ajudado a organizar, de ter sido um parceiro da organização, é um dos patrocinadores. Então, eu queria agradecer muito Diego e Paulo, que trabalharam para a gente transformar isso também em um patrocínio, a Associação Paraense de Direito Administrativo. Eu queria agradecer a Jurimétrica e a equipe deles de tecnologia, Bare Metal Lab. A gente precisou mudar a plataforma, porque ela não funcionaria, e a gente teve que pôr no ar em 3 dias uma plataforma nova, e aí as primeiras horas em que eu estava programando de novo era divertido, a terceira noite sem dormir já deixou de ser divertido, e aí a gente teve o socorro deles, que foram ao longo aquele exercício de trocar o pneu com o carro andando, foram colocando no ar a plataforma que a gente vê, não só do site, mas de recepção de inscrições, de uma série de ferramentas administrativas que a gente usou até agora, e eu espero não ter esquecido ninguém, né? Paranaense. Eu falei o quê? Paraense. Eu comi enfim. Paranaense, desculpe, a Paranaense de Direito Administrativo. É isso, eu acho que eu devolvo a palavra ao anfitrião, porque quem encerra é o anfitrião, senão a gente não volta, aquela coisa que você não abre a porta para sair, né? E agradeço novamente a presença, evidentemente, de todos os inscritos, todos que se submeteram ao trabalho, todos que, de uma forma ou outra, participaram do evento. É muito ruim não poder ter um tempo muito grande com cada um de vocês, né? Mas todo mundo que me abordava falava, evento desse tamanho parece casamento. Tem gente que te viu, que você tirou foto, você não lembra, você não viu, não cumprimentou. Tem gente que fala que passou por você 10 vezes, mas sintam-se todos abraçados, recebidos e agradecidos por estarem aqui. E aí eu devolvo a palavra aqui para o Paulo.
Bom, certamente gostaríamos de recebê-los no futuro, ou seja, essa história do anfitrião, né, a palavra final, vai ser um prazer muito grande e espero ver esse evento crescendo, né? Eu sei que isso é um desafio para quem está agora concluindo nesse momento, mas temos um tempo para frente, ele tem uma vocação e certamente vai ser muito bom ver novas edições, espero contar também com todos vocês. E com isso, encerramos. Obrigado.